Election day in the United States. Gold holding steady. Markets holding steady. Not sure where to go next. A holding pattern to see what happens. It seems like the bets have been placed. Les jeux sont faits, as they say en français. Hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. Indeed, it is the story that dominates all other stories here, and it's been a huge story in regard to the mining industry, which is, of course, the U.S. elections and U.S. policy towards mining that has really, I would say in the last, 4 years, and even you could say the last 8 years, as Mining.com Editor-in-Chief Cecilia Jamasmie says, we have reached a turning point in regard to U.S. policy in mining. I mean, Trump has always been a pretty big supporter in mining. I think it was 2016 when he was wearing the coal mining outfit and was always a big supporter, so to speak, even initiator in some regards to, exploiting the United States' natural resources in order to really, one could argue, however you want to see it, secure the supply chain. And sure enough, as I discussed with Cecilia, I mean, we see the same thing with Kamala Harris. Even we saw Joe Biden, you could argue even more aggressively with all of the, machinations that are going on with approvals of major lithium projects, with, new partnerships being made with countries really around the world. As Cecilia points out, non-traditional allies. And of course, the Libido Corridor, a major initiative by the State Department and the president. And the reason I mention all this is because for those that were around 10 years ago, it wasn't on the radar. There was still the underlying assumption of mining policy in the U.S., and particularly in the West, was that there would be an endless supply of natural resources coming from countries from around the world, and you didn't need to really do anything but buy the raw materials from places like Indonesia or DRC or wherever, Brazil, and there was no sense that, we need to actually build at least the batteries in these countries. That was a development that happened, I would say, around 2022. I want to say Indonesia was a big initiator of this. As Cecilia points out, COVID was a bit of a turning point as well, where there was a recognition that there is a vulnerability in the supply chains. In a weird way, we saw it with the masks, right? There was a shortage of masks, and all of a sudden, supply chains started to break down. So it's quite interesting to reflect here on Election Day of the really seismic shift, one could argue, that this industry has experienced. And it has really gone from kind of a zero to hero type of situation. And I would say it isn't complete, this cycle. We are on our way, you might say, to hero. And I would say, as I mentioned to Cecilia, our model for this narrative journey, so to speak, really, I think we can look at the nuclear energy industry, where we saw, again, it going from a totally despised industry by much of the population, the first association being toxic waste, to now being, largely embraced, with the exception of Germany. But generally speaking, across the political spectrum, it's a different story. It's not unanimous, but it is a different story. And one could argue the idea that nuclear energy is now a solution for carbon emissions is actually a dominant narrative over the nuclear waste narrative. So one wonders, are we experiencing a similar narrative cycle, so to speak, but delayed in mining? Now, with all that being said, and all of these concerns, we do continue to have incredible developments here going, what I would say, underneath the radar. Last week, I brought Myanmar into the picture with the sensational story that a critical rare earths hub had been taken over by rebels in Myanmar. Now, Myanmar shares a pretty large border with China and also with India and with Thailand and Laos. So it's no small matter that they have a, pretty serious rebellion going on there. And of course, there's a military junta that has been running Myanmar since 2021. As we were discussing last week, and if you didn't hear it, I recommend going back to it, where we go more into detail on the history of the situation. But all to say, the U.S. is backing the rebels from what we're reading here, and China is backing the military junta. This is an important aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative. China has really invested a lot in Myanmar in terms of the natural resources, and a significant amount of the heavy rare earths are being mined in Myanmar. So with all that in mind, let's turn then to a couple of updates here. This is November 3rd. The Global Times, a Chinese newspaper, and it's interesting how the story is presented. Reduced Myanmar supply, quote, to drive rare earth prices higher, end quote. And this is by Song Lin at the Global Times. As November kicks off, the rare earths market is back in the spotlight due to supply disruptions from Myanmar, with analysts noting on Sunday that a sustained rise in prices is expected. After seeing elevated list prices for rare earths in September and October, some Chinese suppliers have increased their prices for 3 months in a row. For instance, Inner Mongolia Baotou Steel Rare Earth announced its list prices for rare earths for November on Friday, revealing a slight month-on-month increase in prices of several products such as praseodymium neodymium oxide, often abbreviated as PRNDO. And here's the kicker. Myanmar accounts for more than 50% of the global heavy rare earth supply. And given the current situation in Myanmar, the rare earth market prices are likely to experience a sustained increase. Wu Chenhui, an independent industry analyst who closely follows the industry, told the Global Times on Sunday. So more than 50% of global heavy rare earth supply is coming out of Myanmar, and that hub was just taken over by the rebels last week. So no small matter here. And just a couple of more lines here. Myanmar mainly produces medium and heavy rare earth iron ores, accounting for 11% of global output in 2023. From January to September, China imported 31,000 tons of rare earth oxides from Myanmar, which constituted 75% of total oxide imports during that period, according to the General Administration of Customs. The suspension of mining operations in Myanmar, along with environmental restrictions on the domestic supply of medium and heavy rare earths, could lead to a shortage in the supply of these materials, a research report released by Huatai Securities said. Now, it's interesting how they describe it as the suspension of mining operations, and this is where I would say, you get a bit of an editorial angle on this story that contrasts with what last week we saw, which was rebels taking over the rare earths hub. And interestingly, I was bringing up last week how China has started to offsource some of the mining of rare earths because of the environmental impact. And now you're starting to see the risk in that strategy. Because as it says here, there are environmental restrictions on the domestic supply of medium and heavy rare earths. So we've been reading about this in a sense for years, this idea that rare earths is not the cleanest business. And just wrapping up this story, in the next 2 to 3 years, the supply landscape for rare earths is not expected to change significantly, with China continuing to account for more than 60% of global supply. Meanwhile, prices are likely to steadily rise into a more sustainable range, Wu added. Multiple related stocks in the A-share market, including Inner Mongolia Baotou Steel Rare Earth and China Rare Earth Resources and Technology, hit their daily limits on Friday. That's just Friday. While rare earth stocks in the Hong Kong market also experienced a rally. So that's your story out of the Global Times. We also have another story from the South China Morning Post. And it's interesting how, the best sources right now on this story are coming out of China. I've done a search on this. I've not seen a ton written about this, which is why I say it's flying under the radar a little bit. So here's the South China Morning Post. And this is from November 4th. So yesterday. The first story was from November 3rd. This is from November 4th. This is Ralph Jennings. And here's the headline: Rare Earths in Spotlight amid U.S.-China tensions, Myanmar turmoil. Armed rebels have taken control of a mining center, and the U.S. election outcome could be anyone's guess. rare earth prices are expected to consolidate recent gains as disruptions in Myanmar curb supplies and as Beijing could ramp up export restrictions amid uncertainty surrounding trade tensions with the United States after its presidential election on Tuesday, according to analysts. Following recent supply disruptions in Myanmar, Chinese state-owned rare earth giant China North Rare Earth Group High-Tech announced list price increases, prompting share price gains for the sector. An armed rebel group has taken over a mining center in Myanmar as part of a more than 3-year-old civil war, Reuters reported on October 23rd. Chinese media outlets say mining operations in the Southeast Asian nation have effectively been suspended. And scrolling down a bit, here is a quote from Lin Song, Greater China chief economist with ING. Quote, as it's an important, though relatively small part of China's trade with the West, this sector could be a retaliatory tool for China in the event we see aggressive tariff action ramp up or a sweetener to achieve a deal down the line, end quote. She added, quote, rare earths and related extraction and processing technologies have already been deployed as bargaining chips in trade disputes, end quote. And as it says here a little further down the article, which you might recall, authorities have banned the export of rare earth extraction technologies along with the technology to make rare earth magnets. China has said it equates its rare earth sector with national security. So you start putting together the associations here, potentially US-backed rebels. I mean, we only have that they're rebels that took over the mining hub, but there was a story that I was referencing in August, which was saying that the US was going to be, to paraphrase, helping the rebels a lot in Myanmar. It's tempting to think these rebels perhaps are, US-backed, but we don't have that directly stated here in the stories. So that is the South China Morning Post. And we also got a story from the Associated Press that was published in Stars and Stripes. And again, you see the military significance here of the story. Head of Myanmar's military government visits close ally China for the first time since taking power. This was published today, November 5th, and it is part of a conference that is taking place, but nevertheless, for the first time, the head of Myanmar's military junta is visiting China. Interesting timing. Now, again, there is a conference of sorts going on, so perhaps it was pre-planned, but the timing, you have to say, is quite interesting. So this is the Associated Press. The head of Myanmar's military government embarked Tuesday on an official visit to China, the embattled Southeast Asian nation's most important international ally, for several regional meetings. It is the first time Senior General Min Aung Hlaing has traveled to the neighboring country since his army seized power in February 2021 from the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar's army suffered unprecedented battlefield defeats over the past year, especially in areas near the Chinese border. Both Myanmar's ruling generals and China's government have shown concern as pro-democracy guerrillas and armed ethnic minority groups, sometimes working hand in hand, have taken the initiative in their fight against military rule. But Beijing is now concerned about instability that threatens its strategic and business interests in Myanmar. China's government has maintained good working relations with Myanmar's ruling military, which is shunned and sanctioned by many Western nations for the army takeover and for major human rights violations. So I imagine, with Myanmar on the border of China, and particularly with the symbolic nature of the rare earths hub being taken over by the rebels, this must be starting to become a bit of a red siren for China's government. It probably already was, if we were to speculate, but this rare earth hub, and when you consider the critical nature of rare earths, it's kind of symbolic. If the military junta can't protect the rare earths hub, what exactly can they protect? You'd think it would be among their top priorities. I mean, wouldn't you? If you're the general? Finally, China, along with Russia, is a major arms supplier to Myanmar's military in its war against resistant forces. Beijing is also Myanmar's biggest trading partner and has invested billions of dollars in its mines, oil and gas pipelines, and other infrastructure. And we have just a couple of more stories that fill in a little bit of the gaps here. This is from RFI.fr, and this is Agence France Presse. Myanmar junta chief visits key ally China. And the subheadline, Myanmar's embattled junta chief arrived in China Tuesday. his first reported visit since leading a coup in 2021. But analysts say the invitation is only a lukewarm endorsement from his key ally and could backfire. Again, one just has to wonder to oneself in the background, is this really about like, hey, we need to talk, Myanmar, because your rare earths hub that's supplying us has just been taken over. Like, what are we going to do here? It's hard not to imagine that conversation taking place at some point. Min Aung Wang was in the southwestern city of Kunming for a summit of the Greater Mekong Subregion, or GMS, a group including China, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia starting Wednesday. The senior general will meet Chinese officials to, quote, develop and strengthen economic and multi-sectoral cooperation, end quote, the junta said on Monday. When the military ousted Wang San Suu Kyi's elected civilian government in 2021, Chinese state media refused to describe it as a coup, preferring, quote, major cabinet reshuffle, end quote. China has stood by the junta since, even as others shun the generals over the brutal crackdown on dissent, which opponents say include massacring of civilians, razing villages with air and artillery strikes. And here just a little bit on the actual battle that's going on in Myanmar. Ming Wang Lang's trip comes with the junta reeling from a devastating rebel offensive last year that seized an area roughly the size of Bosnia, much of it near the border with China. I mean, have you been hearing about this? I mean, this is quite a big story. Analysts say Beijing is worried about the possibility of the junta falling and suspicious of Western influence among some of pro-democracy armed groups battling the military. Myanmar is a vital part of Beijing's trillion-dollar Belt and Road initiative, with railways and pipelines to link China's landlocked southwest to the Indian Ocean. Quote, Beijing has now made clear its intentions for the Myanmar military to succeed, end quote, said Jason Tower of the United States Institute of Peace. And then we have a quote from Richard Horsey, the crisis group's senior Myanmar advisor, who said, quote, China has pivoted to greater support for the regime, not because it is better disposed with the regime or its leader, but out of concern at a disorderly collapse of power, end quote. And then finally, a story out of Al Jazeera. Myanmar military government chief on first visit to allied China since coup. And as it says here, China is a major ally and arms supplier to the military government, but analysts say Beijing also maintains ties with ethnic armed groups which hold territory along its border. So that's kind of interesting as well. Perhaps a hedge. If the military junta falls, then they still have the armed groups on the border. So pretty interesting story there. And finally, adding another piece to the puzzle, the Council of the European Union put out a press release, Myanmar/Burma. And if you go back to last episode, you'll see how the State Department refers to Myanmar as Burma. So this is also a bone of contention, so to speak. And here's the press release. EU lists 3 individuals and 1 entity responsible for scam operations entailing serious human rights violations and threatening the peace, security, and stability of Myanmar and the region. So now the EU is now putting sanctions on individuals from Myanmar's military junta. Interestingly, again, quite a story. Final couple of headlines here. So we have an update on Barrick Gold. And they're having more problems with Mali's military junta government. And the headline here from Seeking Alpha via MSN.com, Barrick Gold denies Mali government claimed it breached agreement. So there was a claim last week that the Mali military junta had said that Barrick breached its agreement. Now, Barrick has said that they haven't. Scrolling down the article a bit, here's the little bit I want to read. So in response to the accusations by Mali's government that they had broken their commitments, Barrick said it has been actively engaged with the government in pursuit of a settlement that would include an increase in the state's share of economic benefits generated by the Lulo-Gunkodo complex. So nothing new there, but then hear this. Quote, while Barrick does not accept any claims of wrongdoing, it has chosen to act in good faith as a long-standing partner of Mali, end quote. The company said, noting it paid $85 million to the government earlier this month in the context of ongoing negotiations. So, to refresh your memory, remember just a month ago when 4 Barrick Gold employees were arrested and then released about, let's call it 5 days later. I don't remember there being an $85 million payment. As far as I've read, that's new. So one wonders if that's how Barrick got back their employees. A kind of ransom of sorts. Here's $85 million, and then we agree to keep talking and see if we can work out our differences. So interesting development there. And so lots going on here. And finally, just a news item, Jack and Adam Lundin are the Northern Miners Persons of the Year for 2024. And that's by Alicia Hyatt at the Northern Miner. So again, Jack and Adam Lundin named Northern Miner Persons of the Year. So coming up, we have Mining.com Editor-in-Chief Cecilia Jamasmie on mining policy in the U.S., and also we have coming up on this week's Spotlight, Mike Spreadborough, CEO of Novo Resources, who discusses the company's exploration projects both in the Pilbara and in Victoria and more. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner. You can find us on Instagram at The Northern Miner and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts and wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to Mike Spreadborough, CEO of Novo Resources, for this week's Spotlight. Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Northern Miner podcast, Mike Spreadborough, CEO of Novo Resources. Mike, welcome to the show.
Good to be back.
It's great to have you. For those that are unfamiliar with Novo Resources, could you give us a brief outline on what you guys are doing over at Novo?
Yeah, really good place to start. So first thing, we're listed on both the TSX and ASX, so that's a bit unusual. We are based in Australia and all of our assets are here in Australia. We are, in our current form, primarily a greenfields explorer. We're out there searching for 1 million ounce type projects that, can be developed and stand alone. So we are an explorer that would like to have projects that we can develop, but very much, we're chasing very early stage projects in our portfolio, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Indeed. Again, listed in Australia and Canada, very interesting. And so you have projects in Australia, in the Pilbara. Tell us about what you're working on.
Yeah, definitely. The Pilbara is the mainstay of our work. So we have over 5,500 square kilometres of tenure. So that's quite a large area. We had a much larger position, but as we've done the exploration work, we're extremely disciplined. If we don't believe the tenements that we have got potential, we get rid of them. Or in recent times, we've discovered other commodities that aren't gold, like lithium and lithium-bearing pegmatites, and we've done some great joint ventures on those, which is really good. So this large tenement package in the Pilbara, in the last 6 months, we've done some drilling at Nunyeri. We've still got to work through that. But the rest of our portfolio in the Pilbara are, at this stage, very early stage, projects where geos have been on the ground, they've done the mapping, they've done the soil sampling, we've done the geophysics. We've now developed the first stage program, which might be 4 or 6, maybe 8 drill holes. So you'll see us early next year start to work our way through 6 or 7 of these early stage projects and see where they get. So, as I said, very, very greenfields. A reminder, the Pilbara is about 1,500 kilometres north of Perth. Already, early November, and it's 40 degrees. So we tend not to drill in November, December, January and February, A, because it is hot, but B, it's cyclone season. So you won't see us do any more drilling in the Pilbara until probably March. But again, lots of good early stage greenfields projects. And like anything, we live to drill a hole into some of these projects and see if they will grow into something that's meaningful for shareholders.
Okay, excellent. And are there certain metals you're looking for, or are you basically looking for prospective properties? Is there anything in particular you're focused on?
That's a very good question, because we are predominantly focused on gold, although like most gold producers or the explorers at the moment, if we tripped over a large-scale copper deposit, we wouldn't be upset. But some of our tenements, we've done enough work to show that they may be prospective for non-gold or non-copper. And in those cases, we will do enough work to try to find value for shareholders, and we will tend to either sell them or joint venture. So as I said, we've done that with some pegmatites that were lithium bearing. We've done it previously with tenements that had more of a nickel focus. So those non-gold, non-copper type occurrences that we find other ways to get shareholder value, but we particularly do not want to use our cash to progress those projects.
So you have projects in the Pilbara, and there's also the Victoria project.
Yeah, so Victoria's on the other side of the country, down in Victoria Way in the southeast of Australia. So we have a small parcel of land called Belltop. It's only 22 square kilometres, so a little bit different to 5,000 square kilometres. But we like Belltop. And why is it exciting? Look, it's adjacent to an old historical gold field called the Castlemaine Goldfields. That part of Victoria has produced over 60 million ounces. So it's been very prospective. Our ground is only 50 kilometres away from the very large high-grade gold project called Fosterville, which is owned by Agnico. So the region has got a lot of potential. We've owned these tenements for a while under joint venture, and 2 years ago we took over ownership 100% because we worked out we were doing all the hard thinking and hard working, so why not own them? We've done 2 drill programs. We did a program earlier this year with some really great results. And magically from that, our geos got their eye in, and we went back to some historical core and discovered that people should have sampled more of that core. So we did that, and we got some great results from that. So it's early stage, but we've now developed a really good 3D geological model of about 6 to 8 gold reefs. They're narrow, high grade. Still got to do the work to understand the continuity, but we understand them well enough that we've actually put together an exploration target. So what does that mean? So that means we've used all the best knowledge we've got and said to people, hey, this is what we think the prospectiveness of the project is. So we released that a month ago or so, and we've said, look, based on what we know now, we think there's 300,000 to 600,000 ounces in this area based on our current knowledge, running at 6.4 to around 8 grams per tonne. So they're really good numbers to start off with. I do refer people back to our website because there's a lot of disclaimers on exploration targets because it's very conceptual. But we will now use that information to develop the next drill program, which will all be about how do you firm up that exploration target to an early stage resource, maybe an inferred resource or at least a pathway to that. So that's what people will see sometime next year. But again, really interesting projects because these are high-grade, narrow veins or reefs, a bit like Fosterville and others. Not too far away from a big processing plant at Fosterville, and there's actually another one across the field. So we like Belltop. It's interesting. It's very different to the Pilbara where you're normally chasing 1.5 to 2 gram material in million ounces, where Victoria is normally high-grade, very prospective, and hopefully very profitable.
Sounds like the company is very focused on exploration, so to speak. Is that kind of a fair assessment? Like, in a sense, are you trying to build a big mine somewhere? Are you trying to just kind of get valuable areas? Like, how are you approaching this?
Yeah, so Novo at one stage did have an operation which we, shut down because of economic reasons, and we've now solved that. So in our current form, we've taken the tenement package we had at that time, which was over 10,000 square kilometres, and we've been working on that tenement package. We own that. How do you optimise that? And, we've been quite successful. We've brought in over $22 million through our joint ventures, and I should talk about our gold joint ventures in a minute. So that's been quite successful. So, that's been our focus up until kind of now is, how prospective is our ground? And, we've done a great job in Victoria, and we've kind of really pulled apart the Pilbara to have really early stage exploration is all that is left. We do have a very interesting investment portfolio, which we hope to monetize and get some cash early next year, which is around about 40 to $50 million Australian. So we've started a project looking for other projects in Australia and Canada that are a little bit more up the pipeline. So, not exploring projects, but projects that we would call drill ready, projects that might have a small resource, or they might even got to a scoping study or in Canadian terms of PEA, where people like us with a great expertise in geology and a technical team and cash can come in there and grow the projects to a decision to mine. So we're out there looking for those projects. Again, gold and copper. We're not fussy. We've got great open pit and underground experience. So we want to build that portfolio using our investment capabilities. So, and dual listed means we've got access to capital in both sides of the world, both ASX, predominant great mining company area of funds, and the TSX, an absolutely great platform to raise money. So the long-term plan, keep being a greenfields explorer, but let's look for some more advanced projects that we can push ahead and develop for shareholders.
So you mentioned there's a joint venture with De Grey. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, we talk about, the Pilbara and our great tenement package. We've done joint ventures on lithium, but we've done a joint venture of gold with De Grey. So that kind of is a bit strange. Gold is our cup of tea. We had a number of tenements that are adjacent to De Grey's Hemi Gold project in the Pilbara. Now, that project, for people that don't know, De Grey is now valued $3 billion on the ASX, Australian $3 billion market cap. They are developing a project which has 12 million ounces in resource. They're out there trying to get the funding to start off with because they've done a DFS. They're already organising long lead items. So these tenement packages we had 30 kilometres away from their proposed first processing plant, and they're proposing a second processing plant, which is 5 kilometres away. So this is a big project. They want to produce 400,000 to 500,000 ounces of gold a year. So we saw in our early stage exploration the same type of mineralisation, same structures, the same elements and tenure as De Grey saw. So we saw advantage in really doing a joint venture with them. And so they have to spend $25 million within 4 years to earn 50% of the project. So that's amazing, isn't it? $25 million on an early stage project. So just think of the maths to only earn 50%. So the Novo shareholders have huge upside. Anything we find, we won't need to build a processing plant because it'll go into De Grey's processing plant. They have the IP or they know the geology better than anyone else do. So a really significant asset for us. They've already spent $7 million, which was the minimum milestone. So they've got another $18 million to go, which I think as they accelerate end of next year, you'll see the joint venture formally formed in 2026. But I just can't reiterate how great that joint venture is for shareholders who like exploration, and it's a good leverage into De Grey.
As a final question, what would you like investors to know about Novo Resources?
Yeah, look, I think the 4 key things is we are a very disciplined gold explorer with a great team. That focus on gold and copper, I think, is important. It's a good place to be. Gold price is absolutely absurd, which is good, and I think copper is going to be a great element going forward. So we're focused on the right commodities. The jurisdictions we play with in Australia and in Canada, we don't have projects in Canada, but we're out there looking. I think they're great mining jurisdictions. And at the end of the day, we've got a pretty good balance sheet going forwards with the ASX and TSX. So again, very focused, early stage gold explorers. I always say you've got to have faith in gold, and you should always have a good gold explorer in your portfolio.
Mike Spreadborough, CEO of Novo Resources, thank you for joining us on this week's CEO Spotlight. And thank you once again to Novo Resources for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit novoresources.com. Turning to the website, gold demand tops $100 billion as Western investors charge in. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Global gold demand swelled about 5% in the third quarter, setting a record for the period and lifting consumption above $100 billion for the first time, according to the World Gold Council. The increase, which saw volumes climb to 1,313 tons, was underpinned by stronger investment flows from the West, including more high-net-worth individuals, that helped offset waning appetite from Asia, the industry-funded group said in a report on Wednesday. Buying and bullion-backed exchange-traded funds flipped to gains in the quarter after prolonged outflows. Now, this recalls Jeffrey Christian saying that part of the demand for gold, and I was mentioning the laundry list of reasons that were given, uncertainty around the U.S. election, geopolitical tensions. Another big one that hasn't been mentioned that Jeffrey Christian mentioned in the past is simply diversification by high net worth individuals who have done fabulously in the stock market and who are perhaps sensing times are pretty good right now and maybe it's time to diversify. And interestingly, that is part of what this article seems to be saying here. Let's continue. Gold has stormed higher this year, rallying by more than a third and setting successive records. The jump has been driven by robust central bank buying and increased demand from wealthy investors, with recent gains aided by the Federal Reserve's shift to cutting interest rates. Purchases in the opaque over-the-counter market were becoming an increasingly important force for prices, according to John Reed, the Council's chief market strategist. Quote, demand has switched through the course of this year from predominantly emerging market OTC buying or over-the-counter buying, in other words, high net worth individuals, as it says here, towards very much more Western over-the-counter buying, end quote, Reid said. OTC transactions are done through dealers or between buyers and sellers directly without an exchange. And I wonder if that perhaps suggests that's more physical buying if it's over-the-counter. Let's continue. Gold, which set a record of $2,790 an ounce on Wednesday, and I believe I saw it at $2,800, has registered gains every month this year, apart from a minor pullback in January and in June when prices were flat. Quote, the fact that corrections have been very shallow and short is a keen indication of FOMO buying, end quote, Reid said in an interview, referring to investors' so-called fear of missing out. As the rate-cutting cycle gets underway, the World Gold Council expects to see increased allocation to bullion, with geopolitical uncertainty, particularly surrounding next week's tight U.S. presidential election, adding to reasons why investors are seeking to hold the haven asset. And finally, investment flows were key to the metal's 13% gain in the third quarter, with total demand for ETFs, bars, and coins reaching the strongest level since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Central bank purchases continued, with Poland, Hungary, and India among the top buyers. Even as the pace of official activity slowed, jewelry demand fell as record prices hurt consumption. Looking ahead, fiscal concerns, especially about swelling levels of government debt in the U.S., may become more pronounced as a driver, according to Reid. And finally, there are concerns, including from the International Monetary Fund, quote, saying the deficit's too big and really needs to be sorted out, end quote, Reid said. Quote, that's the primary attraction from the OTC community to increase their gold holdings, end quote. So very interesting article. Turning to our next story, another kind of U.S.-themed story here. This is Reuters via mining.com. Environmentalists sue over U.S. approval of Ioneer's Nevada lithium mine. Now, Cecilia brings this up in our interview, so I wanted to also bring this to your attention. Environmental and indigenous groups on Thursday filed a lawsuit challenging the U.S. Interior Department's approval of Ioneer's Rhyolite Ridge lithium mine in Nevada, the first domestic source of the battery metal to be permitted by Democratic President Joe Biden's administration. It's quite interesting. It's only at the very end of the administration that this is getting done. In a lawsuit filed in federal court in Las Vegas, groups including the Center for Biological Diversity argued the project posed an existential risk to the rare wildflower Teams buckwheat and could drive it to extinction. This is Reuters, by the way. They said the mine would also adversely impact groundwater, springs, wetlands, air quality, cultural resources, and wildlife habitats and would transform a remote part of rural Nevada into an industrial complex. The group said the Interior Department's Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, approved the mine without ensuring that it would not jeopardize the wildflower or unduly impact the environment in violation of the National Environmental Policy Act, the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, and the Endangered Species Act. The Interior Department declined to comment. Australia-based Ioneer said it does not expect the lawsuit to, quote, meaningfully affect our proposed development timeline, end quote, and that it believes the project can be developed sustainably. Quote, we are confident that the BLM will prevail against this lawsuit, end quote, said Chad Yeftik, Ioneer's Vice President of Corporate Development and External Affairs. Quote, we intend to intervene and vigorously defend the BLM's decision, which was based on its careful and thorough permitting process, end quote. And this is following, as it says here, a more than 6-year review process, during which regulators, Ioneer, and conservationists tussled over the fate of Teams buckwheat. Incredible. You know, just for contrast, you don't get the sense that China would even think twice about not developing a major mine because of a wildflower. So pretty interesting there. Continuing on, Freeport probed by SEC over quake risk at Indonesia copper plant. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Very interesting story. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is looking into whether Freeport-McMoRan failed to disclose threats a severe earthquake could pose to its new $3.7 billion copper smelter complex in Indonesia, according to people familiar with the matter. So, talk about an unexpected lawsuit. SEC officials began reviewing whether the firm should have made certain disclosures to investors after a senior engineer who worked as a contractor for Freeport filed a whistleblower complaint with the regulator, said the people who asked not to be identified discussing the confidential matter. The unidentified former contractor alleged the complex could collapse into the sea during a significant tremor, according to a copy of the document reviewed by Bloomberg News. Freeport allegedly ignored the advice of experts and relied on engineering designs that didn't meet Indonesia's code for earthquake-resistant buildings, according to the complaint, which was filed in 2022. The document alleges that a collapse of the facility could threaten human lives and the environment, cause turmoil in metals markets, and hurt Freeport's business and its share price. And scrolling down a bit, a spokesman for the SEC declined to comment. And finally, Freeport rejects the whistleblower complaint's claims. In a statement, the company said the smelter project underwent, quote, multiple subject matter expert reviews, end quote, confirming that the engineering design and construction were, quote, fully compliant with all applicable Indonesian building codes, end quote. Quote, safety remains Freeport's number one priority, end quote, said Linda Hayes, a spokesperson for Freeport. Quote, it is a matter on which we do not compromise, end quote. Continuing on, Ivanhoe cuts copper forecast on DRC power woes while Friedland touts new discoveries. This is by Henry Lazenby at the Northern Miner. Ivanhoe on Wednesday reported record third-quarter copper production, but cut its full-year guidance by 6%, blaming power outages at its Kamoa-Kakula complex in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Henry continues, the disruption stemmed from deficient transmission capacity and instability in the DRC's southern grid managed by state-owned Société Nationale d'Électricité, delays in upgrading the Inga 2 Dam's transmission line, and grid bottlenecks at the Kolwezi substation limited reliable power delivery. So it continues to be a bit of an issue there in Central and South Africa. South Africa itself seems to have resolved the issue, but it's quite interesting. And here's COO Mark Farren on an investor conference call who said, quote, we've broken the back of the power problem, but some solutions will take longer to reach full capacity. We're not only fixing grid issues, but securing long-term power solutions, end quote. So it sounds like they are committed to really solving the power issue at the Kamoa-Kakula complex in the DRC. Continuing on, another headline, Saudi Arabia in advanced talks over Zambia copper mine stake, Ma'aden CEO says. And we've been tracking this story for the last few weeks. This is Reuters via mining.com. Saudi Arabia is in the advanced stages of talks about a stake in a copper mine in Zambia and is expecting a deal by the end of the year, the CEO of Saudi Arabia's flagship mining company, Ma'aden, told Reuters on Wednesday. Quote, we are looking at Zambia. We're talking with a company there, with a mine there, so those are pretty advanced stage discussions, end quote. CEO Robert Wilt, who is also vice chairman of Saudi Arabia's international mining venture, Manara Minerals, said. Quote, we'd have something wrapped up by the end of the year, end quote. Wilt, speaking on the sidelines of the Future Investment Forum conference in Riyadh, said. Sources told Reuters earlier this month that Manara, a joint venture between Ma'aden and Saudi Arabia's $925 billion public investment fund, was closing in on a deal to buy a minority stake in Canadian miner First Quantum Minerals' Zambian copper and nickel assets. And Wilt also said, quote, obviously Africa is mineral rich with a lot of copper in the copper belt. So it just makes perfect sense because the geographical proximity and our desire for copper to be looking in Africa, end quote. Very interesting. And just a headline, copper output from Codelco down nearly 5% this year, but recovery expected. So it's a political issue over in Chile, from what I understand. And this is a Reuters headline via mining.com. It is a badge of pride, Codelco and the copper production of Chile. So it was down 5% this year, but they expect to recover next year. Continuing on, Alcoa, quote, very bullish, end quote, on aluminum for energy transition. This is Reuters via mining.com. Very short article. Alcoa is very bullish on aluminum as the energy transition drives demand growth, including substitution away from copper. CEO William Opplinger said on Wednesday, quote, as we look forward, demand growth will be driven by this energy transition, end quote, he said, adding that as demand outstrips supply for copper, demand for aluminum will grow because it is a ready substitute in some applications, he told a conference in Sydney. Megatrends are driving aluminum demand of 3%, 4%, and 5% every year, he said. Quote, couple that with some supply changes in the industry, for instance, the Chinese sticking to a mandatory cap they have put in place, that shapes up to a much stronger aluminum market globally, end quote, he said. And continuing on and relating to our discussion with Cecilia, Australian rare earths developer ASM eyes U.S. defense funding. This is Reuters via mining.com. And just a line here, rare earths developer Australian Strategic Materials sees more funds becoming available for rare earths projects from the United States Department of Defense, even if there is a change in administration, its CEO said on Tuesday. Quote, the magnet supply chain is actually in a really good position regardless of which U.S. government comes in, end quote, CEO Rowena Smith told Reuters. And another headline, Lynas Rare Earths first quarter revenue falls nearly 6%. That's Reuters via mining.com, so still a tough business. Another headline, China's Cobalt King hits output goals months ahead of schedule. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com, so China continues to put pressure on global prices of cobalt. And also a headline here by Bloomberg News via mining.com. Lithium woes hold top China producers to year-to-date losses. China's two biggest lithium producers remained in the red 9 months into the year as the battery metal downturn continues to squeeze the industry. And just a line here, in China, the material is 88% cheaper than its peak in late 2022. So lithium down almost 90%. And finally, Botswana's Debswana diamond sales fall over 50% in first 9 months of 2024. This is Reuters via mining.com. So sales in rough diamonds fell about 52% in the first 9 months of 2024. Data released by Botswana's central bank on Tuesday showed as the downturn in the global diamond market persisted. So the diamond market continues to struggle. Those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.31%. That is 0.01% higher, so barely edging higher there. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.48%. That is 0.2% higher than last week. And don't forget, when there was the big pension crisis, it basically hit 4.5%. So here we are. UK 10-year gilt at 4.48%, a little bit of a yellow to orange flag. The Italy 10-year bond is yielding 3.69%, so that is up 0.16% on the week. And also the German 10-year Bund is yielding 2.41%, that is 0.09% higher than last week. And the Japanese 10-year bond, bucking the trend, lower at 0.93%, and that is down 0.06% on the week. So yields higher, except for Japan, where they are lower. And UK, one wonders if that's potentially a little bit of trouble over there. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $2,752.20 per ounce. That is down $11 on the week. Silver is trading at $32.80 per ounce. That is down $1.46 on the week. Platinum is trading at $978.30 per ounce. That is $58 lower than last week. And palladium is trading at $1,074 even. That is down $140 on the week. So 2 weeks ago, palladium was at $1,045. Then we had a big jump on a news story, and it jumped all the way to $1,214, and now we're back at $1,074 on palladium. So almost returning to where it was, interestingly. Turning to industrial metals. Copper is trading at $4.40 per pound. That is 7 cents higher than last week. Iron ore is trading at $102.49 per metric ton. That is $2 lower than last week. Aluminum is trading at $1.19 per pound. That is a penny lower than last week. Lead is trading slightly higher at 93 cents per pound. That is a penny higher than last week. Nickel is trading at $7.31 per pound. That is 5 cents higher than last week. Tin is also higher at $14.39 per pound. That is 37 cents higher than last week. Cobalt is unchanged at $11.02 per pound. Lithium is slightly higher at $10.22 per kilogram. That is 19 cents higher than last week. Uranium is lower at $78.75 per pound. That is $2.30 lower than last week and back below $80, interestingly. And zinc is slightly lower at $1.38 per pound. That is 5 cents lower than last week. Zooming out, it appears to me that basically metals markets, perhaps like the stock market, in a bit of a holding pattern here, awaiting the results of the U.S. election and whether there will be a clean win or not on either side, and if there's going to be any trouble surrounding that election. So, as I said to open the show, les jeux sont faits. The bets are made, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Northern Miner podcast, Cecilia Jamasmie, Editor-in-Chief of Mining.com. We focus on U.S. mining policy and what the United States is really doing, whether it's domestically, internationally, and its evolving approach to the mining industry, and really how it's becoming much more bipartisan, and how the narrative is changing over the years. As Cecilia says, we've reached a turning point in regard to mining policy in the United States. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you on the other side. Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Northern Miner podcast, Cecilia Jamasmie, Editor-in-Chief of Mining.com. Cecilia, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adrian. Glad to be back.
Well, it's always great to talk to you. You're neck deep in this whole mining industry narrative as Editor-in-Chief of Mining.com. And here we are, the U.S. election here on our doorstep. So I thought maybe we could start there. I mean, from your perspective, from what you're reading and seeing, where are we with mining in the United States? What are some of the big themes? What are some of the big questions that people are asking in regard to mining and the United States?
Well, as you said, with the U.S. presidential elections going on at the moment, definitely mining policy is a critical point, even for those who don't know why. They know that somehow this impacts on supply chain, economic stability, and geopolitical standing, depending on who gets elected. We've seen in the past years how the U.S. has been increasingly focused on securing critical minerals such as lithium and nickel and rare earths, essentially for all the technologies ranging from electric vehicles to renewable energy to infrastructure, etc. So why now? And that's where it gets interesting, because there's a lot of factors, and we could maybe talk briefly about the change in the policy and the efforts to put domestic production to lessen the dependency in other countries. Particularly, we are talking about here China and Russia. That's the main issue, as we all know. As I said, the U.S. has been intensifying its focus on domestic mining and refining, not just mining. And that's very important because that was one of the lacking factors, not only in the U.S. If we look at other countries, including Canada, the efforts were first on mining. And quickly they realized that countries like China, again, they control many of the refining capacity as well. So what's the point of extracting minerals just to sell it there and then pay more for them when they come back refined and so on? If they come back, their national security concerns, the U.S. considers that a stable supply of critical minerals is key for their own defense technologies and clean energy, high-tech industry, and also the supply chain resilience. We noticed that during the COVID-19 pandemic, highlighted the vulnerability of global reliance. And I think that was kind of like the trigger that put governments into action and into look at strengthening the local market, the local companies first. So the U.S. has been investing in domestic production, rolling out incentives for exploration and production of critical minerals. We've seen in the news lots of announcements, especially a few months before the elections, such as grants, tax breaks, and also financial support to encourage companies to develop mining and refining capabilities. And another interesting step that the U.S. has taken, that I've seen it replicated in many other countries, is this new concept of public-private partnership. The government is partnering with private companies to invest in the development of processing facilities within the U.S. borders. And we've seen that in many other countries. We've seen it in Chile a couple of years ago when Chile declared lithium a strategic mineral and said, we are not giving you any license unless you partner with us, the state. And that kind of triggered a lot of controversy and discussion. And we can see that the US and Canada and many major countries are doing it too. So that's an interesting change in views. But going back to the US, they also have legislation and initiatives such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act have allocated funding especially for domestic mining and supply chain resilience. That's new, but it's big. The goal, once again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, is to reduce the U.S. dependence on foreign sources, Russia and China, especially for critical materials. And I think that most of the people who listen to this podcast already know that China controls 65 to 80% of the rare earth supply, but more than 90% of the refining capacity. So it's going to be a hard race to get close to where China is now, especially we think about the China's Belt and Road initiative that has strengthened ties with nations that here in the Western Hemisphere we were like not looking at very closely. You know how China has gone into Africa and have control of so many key sources of cobalt and copper and you name it. And then we have Russia that has large reserves of nickel, palladium, platinum, key metals for EV batteries and all that. And they have their own strategic reserves that are going to be used and are being used only internally. And that is also interesting to look at for geopolitical gain. And the US response so far has been coming up with trade policies, export controls, import controls. But as I said, they came to the conclusion, as it shows, that what they need is a diversified supply base. And therefore, they're even providing money to companies that are outside the US, as long as they commit to supply to them. We've seen them providing money to companies in Brazil in the past 2 weeks, in Argentina. That's just two of the examples that come to my mind, like immediately. So I would say they are expanding, but always looking at the domestic market.
What an excellent overview you've given us here on the general kind of concerns and the kind of ideas that are moving through policymakers' heads here and some of the big topics they're thinking about. I mean, I think one of the big, I suppose I would say, developments we've seen on the election front and just since the last election even is really, I would say, the Democratic Party really embracing to a certain degree, to your point, with all of these deals. I mean, this is under a Democrat administration, right? And I mean, traditionally, let's say 10, 15 years ago, to have the Democratic nominees say, we need to stockpile metals, as Kamala Harris has done. I don't want to say it's unthinkable, but it would have been pretty contrarian, shall we call it. So from an industry perspective here, we have seen quite the development, haven't we? And whatever the outcome here, it seems that mining is on the agenda as far as being a positive and not a negative. What do you think?
Oh, definitely. We've seen them in like very concrete examples. For instance, MP Materials that reopened the Mountain Pass rare earth mine in California. And that is supposed to be, I would say it has already become one of the very few domestic sources of rare earth. And that's happened under the Biden administration. If we remember years ago when Obama was in charge, he passed some laws to not let anybody mine uranium near the Grand Canyon and similar regulations to protect federal lands and so on. And this administration, even though has a high respect for the environment, they've been more flexible. They acknowledge that the need to boost the domestic market and the supply is there and they have to do it. So we have seen how companies like MP Materials, Lithium Americas, and Albemarle all benefit from federal investments and also from incentives. So that's a change in a good way, I would say. Despite growing support and all these regulations, there's still some challenges that companies have to try to overcome, not only in the US, but all over the world. And that's the old friend community opposition. There's always opposition to opening new mines or expanding existing ones. So that's something that any administration is going to have to deal with. Something else very interesting that only happened a couple of weeks ago is that the coal communities, there was a huge industry in the States, as we all know, and many have closed, if not most of them, in the last 10 years. And the government of the US now is investing in supporting these communities, helping them to reinvent themselves, and especially making them embrace renewable energy and trying to make them work in lithium, in processing. So I think that that was a very smart strategic move. Those communities that seem abandoned for years and years, all of a sudden they're heard, they're given new tools. So elections are good, aren't they? They help rush up some things that need to be done.
Indeed, it does tend to focus the politicians a little bit on a little bit of policy there. And I think it's so interesting, this dynamic that you're bringing up, which is this idea that government support is not necessarily enough if the community is against it. And I mean, we see this in in Serbia with the Jadar mine with Rio Tinto, this lithium mine, in a sense, a green energy project. And, you read the stories on it, and it's just like issue number one in the country is in the left and the right, against this mine. So, I mean,
opposition, even though we all know in theory how good it would be to be providers of lithium in this time and age. And you have a very similar example that happened to First Quantum in Panama, that huge copper mine, Cobre Panama, that was canceled. And the main reason, again, community opposition. So we can say the locals are getting more and more empowered as time goes, and it's impossible to ignore that part of the equation anymore.
Yeah, it's a great point. And just in terms, if we're speculating here, do you think part of the reason perhaps of this happening is maybe the government understands to a certain degree the situation because they're forced to? They realize there's an economic imperative here. There's just, to get from point A to point B, we basically have to do this. Whereas maybe the community and the general public perhaps is just doesn't have the same sense of urgency, in a sense, that this needs to happen in order for us to have a greener energy grid and get off fossil fuels.
It's kind of this romantic view that is not bad, but that is in parallel of what's going on with the urgency the world has for critical minerals. There's this other movement we've seen that is embracing the environment, trying to reduce emissions. Everything that is sold that has the green word on it, green energy, green product, green everything, is like more value because people understand that we are at a point of, Gutierrez said 2 weeks ago, we are at a point of no return. The earth is getting warmer and warmer, and it seems that we are not going to be able to reach any of the goals that were set in the Paris Agreement. So we have all that talk, the research, the news. Honestly, like every day I hear at least 2 different news about this report shows we're not going to make it. This report says that we may make it if we stop doing all these things altogether. So the public that is not specialized in particular, they have that in mind, right? And then the government's like, yes, it's true. But in order to become greener, we need these materials. And how are we going to get them? We need to mine them. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect still in the discourse. I don't think the general public really understand how important it is to try not to block every single major project that is coming, especially if those projects are taking us in the direction that the world needs.
Yeah, beautifully put. And it's almost like we're seeing like an evolution of the narrative. It's like the politicians, perhaps they understand, but they're only just beginning to explain. Like you saw it with Kamala Harris, maybe a few weeks ago with the stockpiling. And, you go to the undersecretaries and the State Department, you have gotten the sense of the importance, as well as, Anthony Blinken. But other than that, we haven't seen a huge amount of explanation. You might say, some people criticize the mining industry as not telling its story well enough. And it's almost like the politicians are now going to have to start telling this story, that just like we saw with the nuclear energy, that instead of nuclear energy meaning toxic waste, it means no carbon emissions, a change in narrative. In a sense, we're going to have to see a similar thing go with mining, that, rather than dirty and dangerous, this is what's going to save the environment, right? So it almost feels like the politicians now, that's maybe where this is going.
Because the general public nowadays, in my opinion, if you said mining industry 15 years ago, it's not the same saying, oh, the mining industry now. It's not just there to dig holes and extract minerals. There's a lot of real efforts to cut emissions, to do things in a more sustainable way, to respect environmental and indigenous rights, to also get more international collaboration. All those things that when I started covering the mining industry were kind of, as you said, unthinkable or too good to be true. This is not going to happen. Well, it is happening. And I don't think that the general public is fully aware of this. They may think it's a bit of propaganda, just cleaning their images as mining companies. But I'm happy to see and say that there's more than that. It's not just a PR campaign going on.
Yeah, as I describe it to people, it's no longer, I would say, and maybe this is overstating it, but it's no longer something to keep a secret that you're involved with the mining industry as a narrative, so to speak, just like, it would have been in the nuclear energy industry 10 years ago. You wouldn't exactly advertise that to new people you met at a cocktail party unless you had to, perhaps. And now it's sort of like you feel slightly less self-conscious, shall we say, in that regard, because it's like, well, actually, if you don't realize what's going on here, perhaps, that maybe, again, the narrative seems to be shifting. I say this all to illustrate. So we've kind of discussed the big picture and the abstract nature of this. And we looked at the practical example in Serbia with the Jadar mine with Rio Tinto. Are we seeing any kind of similar dynamics, say, in the United States?
Well, actually, very recently, we had the Australian company called Ioneer getting the approval to go ahead with the lithium mine in Nevada. It's the first domestic source of lithium that has been approved under Biden. And it took not more than 3 days for a group of environmental and indigenous people to file a lawsuit challenging the U.S. Interior Department's approval. So as you can see, it's not only in Europe, it's not only in South America. In the US itself, we have opposition to this. And all of this opposition is based on environmental concerns. In this particular case, they're talking about a wildflower that is apparently unique to the area, etc. And a flower is enough, could be enough to stop a major project. This mine has so much lithium in it, this project, that when in operations, it could be powering around 370,000 electric vehicles a year. And the construction, if everything goes well and the lawsuit doesn't succeed, they can start as early as late 2027 or early 28.
That is a new one. I've never heard the a wildflower argument. Of course, you often will hear of animals or whatnot, but flower, I haven't heard that yet. So, okay, so super interesting. And you also mentioned the importance of these minerals in defense. And as we've seen with antimony, China restricting exports, or at least putting export controls, shall we say. And of course, rare earths have long been discussed, and other metals, whether it's aluminum or you name it. So what has the Pentagon been doing? I mean, they've been taking a surprisingly active role from my perspective here at the podcast. When I'm reading these stories, I'm kind of impressed at how overt the role of the Department of Defense is in the U.S. What are you seeing over there?
Oh, most definitely. The Pentagon is trying also to secure all sorts of materials that they're going to need for weapons and securing especially cobalt, because cobalt has emerged as like a key material to build military hardware batteries and electronics used in, I want to say, espionage. So we recently saw, just at the end of August, we saw that the Pentagon made its largest investment known in Canada. Basically, they gave 20 million to this company to build the first cobalt refinery in Ontario. They say that it's supposed to be like the largest, once in operation, supposed to be the largest cobalt refinery in all North America. And the company is gaining support from private investors after this announcement. The name of the company, if you haven't heard, is Electra Battery Materials. And they have already signed agreements with LG Energy Solutions and other private companies that are giving the money so they can actually secure cobalt for their own purposes, their own batteries, their own needs in the electric vehicle sector. It was very interesting because it covered headlines all over the world. Being in Canada, we think, oh, well, this is important because it's a Canadian company. But I saw it in British media, Australia. It was a huge deal.
It's a head-turning headline, when the Pentagon starts investing in, critical minerals projects in, foreign countries. I mean, it is Canada, just north of the border, but nevertheless, and I guess we could wrap it up on this subject, which is the kinds of partnerships you're also seeing the U.S. make with other countries around the world. What kind of, deals, just from memory, some of the countries you've heard of deals being made? I mean, just tell us some of the things you've been seeing.
Oh, most definitely. They have invested in the past 2 weeks only. I've seen them invest millions in Brazil and also in Argentina. Argentina, they're going for lithium. In Brazil, they are aiming at nickel. So as we see, they're all battery metals that they are putting their money on. And in jurisdictions that are not, I wouldn't say that they are risky, but they are not their usual partners. It's not the NAFTA agreement with Mexico and the US. They're going everywhere. South America, Africa. The goal here is to secure supply no matter from where.
Okay, excellent. And just final thoughts here. I mean, how do you assess? I mean, you've been reading mining news stories, you've been writing mining news stories since before the financial crisis in 2008. So how would you assess, like, how is, say, the U.S. government doing since it is election time? Is there something you feel like they should be doing that they're not doing? What is your sense of how the government is performing in regard to, securing the supply chain, so to speak?
Well, I think that they've been very good at expanding international collaboration, not only with mineral-rich democracies well-established like Australia and Canada, but as I mentioned, also in other countries like Brazil, Argentina, and also in Africa. In summary, I think the U.S. mining policy and mining sector in general has reached a turning point. Whomever wins will have to balance the need for supply with environmental responsibility, international competition, international collaboration, and of course, they're going to have to deal with the expectations of the local communities. So far, the trajectory that the U.S. mining is taking is going to say lots in terms of the country's economy, the strategic positioning of the country, because as the world continues to shift towards clean energy and advanced technologies, the performance of the U.S. mining companies is going to be crucial to either boost or stall the progress towards a green economy.
Cecilia Jamasmie, Editor-in-Chief of Mining.com. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights and perspective on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you once again to Novo Resources for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner podcast. And also thank you to Cecilia Jamasmie for spending time with us and sharing what she's seen as Editor-in-Chief of Mining.com, across the United States and around the world. And thank you, dear listener, for continuing to support this program. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory, share it with your friends, and until next week, take care.